Hello and welcome to show 51 of The Shortlist. My name is Johnny Campbell. I'm your host, CEO and co-founder of Social Talent. And if it's your first time on the show, we really welcome you. We talk about talent topics here every single week, and we have a guest or guests on who hopefully will enlighten you and us as to the topic we're talking about today, which today for show 51 is from traditional to progressive. We're going to talk about TA transformation in a remote world. TA transformation is a theme we've talked about several times before here on the show because it's happening constantly, but in the last year, perhaps even more than ever, as the rulebooks got ripped up with COVID, the pandemic, a cessation of hiring for several months. Then that restarted for a lot of industries, is still restarting or waiting to restart from others in different parts of the world. So really, it's been a crazy year. So there's so much to talk about around talent transformation. And this week's guest is going to bring a brand new perspective, one I suspect you haven't heard before, but with some very universal lessons. Quick reminder for those of you who are looking to find out more about our back catalog and what's coming up next, you can find out all you need to know about the show by going to socialtalent.com/the shortlist. We're a weekly show. We do broadcast live on LinkedIn and YouTube. So if you do happen to have the opportunity to join us, which is typically 4 p.m. in the UK, you can figure out what time that is in your part of the world. You can join in the commentary and the chat live on LinkedIn or YouTube. And if you're listening now live, we'd encourage you to join in later and say hello, tell us where you're listening in from, and to direct any questions you have to our guest through that live chat. We're also a podcast. If you're listening live, you can catch up with all of our shows on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast. Just check out the shortlist and you'll find all our shows there. So back to transforming TA. So it's a difficult thing to do in any time of year, right? But when you are working for a humanitarian aid organization who, for example, right now is looking at the conflict between Israel and Palestine and asking yourselves, how do we get people on the ground? Recruiting looks different and talent acquisition looks different. Whilst many things may be the same, you have this very different mission of your organization. And that drives a lot of different behaviors. And it's kind of probably one of those benefits being you don't have trouble finding purpose in your role, but you do find yourself changing things quite regularly as the world changes without you getting a vote, essentially, when you're working for a humanitarian aid organization. So joining us today is Michel Guye-Bergeret. And Michel is the global head of TA and employer branding for, I'm going to say the Red Cross. And you're going to think, oh, the Red Cross, those people who they help you if you faint at a concert or a football match, or they help crowd control. But actually, he works for the International Committee of the Red Cross, known as the ICRC. And I'm going to get Michel to explain a little bit more about who ICRC are. And Michel's known on the international stage as an innovative, analytical, and strategic TA leader. And he's taken that approach to the team at ICRC over the last 3.5 years to really improve the way that they deliver talent acquisition services to the organization by infusing everything from AI, data, analytics, market intelligence to his approach, but really by enabling an entrepreneurial attitude amongst the team, amongst the members that actually make up the talent acquisition team that work with Michel across the world. And they are a global team, not just because they are working in a distributed manner since COVID, but they've been that way since day one. So Michel has done a lot of work with his team, and he'll give credit to his team most, I think, for the work that's been done the last 3.5 years under his stewardship. But we're really interested to get into what it's like to do transformation in that kind of an environment. But Michel, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you. I've been excited about this episode for some time. I was wondering if you could introduce yourself, and particularly ICRC, and give us a bit of context as to who the organization is, and therefore what does a talent acquisition team do within that kind of an environment. And we've temporarily lost Michel there. That's all right. Michel is somebody I've known for a long time, even before he joined ICRC. And we've had the pleasure in Social Talent of welcoming the team at ICRC to our offices back when we all had offices a couple of years ago, and getting to know what they're doing. And we've been working with them for several years. And the team were able to share some fantastic stories around what you might call real long-term recruiting. The skill sets that ICRC hire for, if you think about who they send into war zones, they're sending in people who may have medical backgrounds, logistics backgrounds, management operations backgrounds. And of course, you have to have a very specific experience. You have to be willing to go into a war zone, and you probably have to have language skills and maybe cultural backgrounds that are right for that particular war zone, or that conflict zone. Because obviously sending somebody in from a certain religion in the middle of a religious conflict is going to cause potential problems. So there's a lot of issues to deal with when you're hiring for an aid organization, and when you're trying to deploy people across different parts of the world, really at short notice. And it takes a certain type of person as well to try and take up that initiative, to join someone like an organization like International Committee of the Red Cross. It isn't for everybody. So in speaking to the recruiters that work with Michel, and have worked many of them since before Michel joined, I learned about how they really had to mine talent in a way that I haven't seen other organizations have to do, and have this long tail approach where you reach out to talent in a traditional organization for a job you're hiring for right now. Yes, ICRC have vacancies they need to fill right now, but they have to build long-term pipeline, several years in the making. And they also have to kind of test that somebody really understands what they're getting into. So if you imagine that you're recruiting for a role, somebody is going to go into a war zone or conflict zone, they're going to have to work with either side impartially, or both sides impartially, and deliver on their mission. And they're probably not going to see home for many, many months. They're going to have to work in very unusual conditions. They're not going to have the luxuries and trappings that you'd expect perhaps of someone with their background or career. You need to know that there's somebody who has the attitude and aptitude to be able to cope in that. So from an assessment point of view or an interview point of view, it isn't as simple as, send out a codility interview and then do 2 rounds of interviews, and if they pass the behavioral interview, you're in. There's a lot more involved. And the complexity, therefore, of hiring for such an organization is pretty amazing. But you can imagine that an organization like that, which is an NGO, it's funded by many, many governments. You could imagine there's a lot of politics in there. You probably wouldn't think of ICRC as being super innovative, embracing of technology, forward thinking. You might think they're a team of executive headhunters who, probably have their own scars and badges, who do things the old school way. And that was the case to a certain degree many years ago. But what Michel's done, and when he rejoins us, hopefully he'll be able to share with us a little more, is he's brought in that the right amount of modernization of that process, looking at data analytics and intelligence, because obviously there's an amazing amount of effort that goes on in that recruiting team that therefore could be wasted. And that's where you bring the benefit of data and insights and intelligence to a team like that, is to understand what patterns do we see in the talent we're hiring. How can we build better assessments to understand if someone is going to be a success? The worst thing you want is first-year attrition. First-year attrition in a corporate environment might mean that we don't get the return on the investment. The person leaves their sales job after 4 months. But first-year attrition working for an aid organization like ICRC might mean that someone cracks in a conflict zone in the middle of nowhere with no way of getting out of there quickly. And that is a massive danger, poses a massive risk, or worse, they're unable to perform their job in the middle of a critical situation where perhaps their skills as a surgeon or a doctor are most needed. But you also need people who can be very adaptable. Whilst you might go to a conflict zone for your particular skills, that's not necessarily all you'll be doing. Many of us are familiar with, in the kind of called the private sector, or most typical 9-to-5 organizations, an individual who wants to do the job they were hired for. And for sure, that's what you get involved with when you sign up for ICRC. But you also have to be able to be super flexible to do pretty much anything that's required of you, of the team. So it really is a situation of teams with core skills, but you might have to do many, many different things in a conflict zone to aid from a humanitarian point of view, the citizens who are caught up in this kind of a mess. And that could include the individuals who are fighting on each side. So, ICRC have, from my experience working with the team, one of the areas that we originally worked with Michel's team on was sourcing. So how could we adapt sourcing for very particular niche requirements, depending on where part of the world you're in and your pronunciations? Because, how do you find individuals who have these language skills? And it's interesting, I was listening to a podcast/webinar from my good friend Balázs in Hungary recently, who talked about how, you look at sourcing, what he calls sourcing 4.0, and how you have to look at the connections of people and the affinity that they might have. And that's how you can find out somebody who's right for the job. So understanding someone has language skills, it's particularly very difficult language skills. It could be language skills for a particularly remote tribe in a part of the world where you don't typically find people who are living abroad and looking for a job like this. So you tend to find yourself searching for a lot of academics or people who've worked in academia, perhaps have taught languages, worked with history, because that often comes first from a sourcing requirement. Do they have the baseline languages? Do they have a cultural understanding of that part of the world? And therefore, will they be comfortable going into this zone? And then second of all, but still very important, do they have the skill we're looking for? So are they a trained surgeon, for example, with these language skills? Or do they have a medical background or background in logistics or any of these core skills? And then the third element that you have to bring in is, do they show or have they shown in their past an aptitude for an environment like this? So have they taken a year out and hiked or done something a bit extreme, or shown that they are not your average person, right? Your average person who perhaps stays in the same city, does a steady 9-to-5 job, just goes on a couple of vacations every year, and that's their knowledge of the world. Again, you can tick the first two boxes, but without that third, again, you're probably not going to be terribly successful. You'll also have to consider fourth, their own personal circumstances. Do they have family? Do they have kids? Things that you're not going to ask in a typical interview scenario are essential to know if you're going to put someone in a conflict zone for 2 years. What are they leaving behind? Is this going to be a massive mental strain for this individual as well? So that sourcing piece was really interesting to get involved in the team initially on. How do you basically really kind of apply those modern sourcing techniques to those very particular requirements? But Michel's team then was able to kind of expand beyond that and build on those skills to look at how they're providing talent intelligence to the business. And again, I use the word business in a very broad sense. Of course, it's a humanitarian aid organization, but how can we provide insights in terms of pipeline of talent that's there as well? And all of this is done by a team that have always worked in a distributed manner. So this is a team that are stretched from Beijing all the way to Sao Paulo in Brazil and everything in between. And they were working remotely long before the pandemic. As you can imagine, there isn't a typical location that you're going to hire for. So it helps and benefits to have a global team. What I'm going to do is jump into our news stories this week. I think there's some really interesting comments here that we can, are kind of items we can touch on that I'd love to try and explore while we're waiting for Michel to come back on. So now I'm going to actually go with our first news story of the week. So first up in the news was this article we found from Information Age from a few weeks back, which is about AI in recruitment, the current state of play. And yes, it's a bit of a blatant plug by the head of the UK for this company called Golden Bees by Ravi Joshi. But if you want to check it out, Information Age, AI in recruitment, the current state of play, and we'll put a link to the article in the comments here. And really this article explores how companies and how recruiting, particularly in the recruiting sector, are implementing AI and automation, and particularly programmatic advertising. And the article makes a number of claims, which I thought were pretty interesting. The first, which I think is quite probably the most controversial, was that when it comes to programmatic tools, that the US has recruitment sector has about 50 to 60% uptake in this area, where the UK, it's around 10%. Now, the author offers zero data to explain that, but it is suggesting that the US is far ahead in using programmatics and AI in the recruiting processes. But it does point to a number of big benefits of technology in terms of bringing your team up to speed, and ones that that resonate with me massively. And programmatic, certainly when it comes to programmatic advertising, is definitely one of those. Michel's back with us now. Thanks for rejoining, Michel. I was just digging into our first article, and I gave an explanation a bit more of my history with your team and what you guys have been doing, or your team has been doing. But I was just talking about the article, and we might just dive straight into it, about AI in recruitment, the current state of play. Love to get your thoughts on that, and maybe if you could expand and tell us a little bit about what is your approach been around things like programmatic AI and technology and tools within your particular team.
Yeah, Johnny, thank you so much. First of all, I apologize. I got a problem with my internet. It went down immediately.
Oh, And it's gone down again for a second, but you're back.
Okay, good. So now I'm 4G. So let's hope it's going to work. So very happy to be here, and thanks so much for the invitation. About the AI and the article, I think from my own personal experience, well, obviously I'm very attached to leverage on technology and use technology as something that can take you to the next level. To be very pragmatic, I think there is two things about AI that I have been experiencing, which is the dream and the reality. The dream is that obviously there's a lot of capabilities and ways actually to move forward. Then there is how you use it and to which extent. To give two concrete examples, we use two different tools for artificial intelligence. One actually to give some support when it comes to write content and have a more diverse and inclusive language when it comes to job descriptions, employer branding, and communication. And the other one is to do better hyper-target recruitment campaigns. So with the support of AI algorithms, we have possibilities of better targeting the populations and the audiences that we want to engage with. So I think there is a lot of sound. There is a lot of interesting promises that you hear. There is part of it a little bit like the sales pitch. There's also a reality that you can if you tweak it the right way, if you use it in the right approach, and you're not expecting to be in dreams, it can really leverage your actions and your results to some point.
I'm going to pause and maybe ask you just to give you some breathing space. Maybe if you could also introduce yourself again, or you're about to introduce yourself. So just reintroduce the team and perhaps in your own words, explain a little bit more about the ICRC's mission, and maybe paint a picture of, considering the technology you're now using, what was it like when you joined, or in the past even, what was the kind of, old version of the TA systems and approach versus some of those tech tools you're describing now, which obviously the team is using. But what was it like when you joined, or even before you joined, and a little bit of context as to the ICRC's mission and what you guys hire for?
Yeah, absolutely, Johnny. So my name is Michel Guye-Bergeret. I'm the head of talent attraction and employer branding at the ICRC from a global perspective. I'm trying to coach, lead, and drive a team of 10 people based in 7 different locations. Our objective is really to take our activity to the next level, to bring the right people to actually help affected populations of armed conflicts. So the ICRC stands for the International Committee of the Red Cross, as you said, Johnny, and there's always the kind of the visuals around the Red Cross and us. There's even actually the International Federation for the Red Cross that is also, we are a movement of the Red Cross. And our mission is really to intervene in armed conflicts or other situations of violence. So I wish I could stop my job, because if I stop my job, it means that there's no more war and people affected for that. So our mission as talent attraction and in talent acquisition arena, two years and a half ago, I joined this team for a very specific pivot. We wanted to bring an activity that was, I would say, a little bit out of the radar, out of the game, in the sense that we were trying to attract so many different profiles with so many different specificities, that with one just single activity, which was events, and for some kind of recruitments, events are still incredibly efficient. But when you have 180 different profiles to recruit, when you are recruiting for 90.
And we may have just dropped Michel on his internet again there. I think just, Michel's trying to convey the complexity of the role profiles, which I mentioned earlier, that the ICRC hire for, which really just, it's hard to, it's hard to really kind of get your head around how different it is from your typical persona that you're recruiting for in a more traditional corporate environment, where there's core roles you recruit for, the same personas in the same team. There's a lot more complexity. Michel, to your team, you're mentioning obviously different, there's no real one role that you recruit for. There's an enormous amount of complexity. I'd indicated just before you came back on air, the language requirements, the cultural nuances you have to think about of deploying someone into those areas. Perhaps you can maybe continue to explain that in your own words.
Absolutely. So yes, Johnny, our daily life is to recruit people with, sometimes 3 languages, so Arabic, French, English, or Portuguese, French, and English. And that's just about the languages. Then we need to target the right skills for sure. So when we're recruiting, a forensic specialist, we're recruiting water and habitat engineers. We are recruiting economic and security specialists. We are also recruiting healthcare professionals, surgeons, midwives, physicians. So it's such a wide palette of recruitments that, we were obliged, so to say, to go from, I would say, a little bit of old school practices to modern approach. And actually our ambition is really to also go the extra mile and go a little bit, push the envelope a little bit further on, and start innovating in the upcoming years. So obviously it takes some time, and today we are in a position that we've managed actually to pivot the team with that level of complexity that we have to deal on a daily basis, and then we're starting getting into the next step, which is the next 3 to 4 years. It's about innovation, and it's about setting a new benchmark in terms of recruitment. And that's the journey that the first journey that we have achieved is to pivot the team, get to the speed that we are. And now actually the ambition is to really move forward and get to a place of innovation.
We had planned to discuss a second article that I'll briefly mention, which is a Forbes article, which talks about remote working, and it's a Harvard professor, and the article's quote called "This Harvard professor reveals the secret sauce for remote work, and has nothing to do with Zoom." And this professor is Siddharth Neely, who's a senior professor in Harvard, who's been teaching remote work for many years before the pandemic. And I want to relate that back to your own situation, because your team were remote before this. There's probably very little change to a certain degree day to day in terms of how your team interact with each other. I wonder, can you walk me through what you've seen from the last 2.5 years working with that team? What has made this successful, and what are some of the elements of distributed working that you think we need to embrace the most? And you touched on ones before we went on air, so I think it's really important to go in there as well.
Absolutely, Johnny. Let me just kind of create a smooth transition from the first article to the second one. And everyone is speaking about AI and AI this and AI that. There's another kind of AI that I have been experiencing over the last 2.5 years, and it's not about artificial intelligence. It's more about attitude and intention. And when it comes to manage a remote team, I was not in COVID times when I started managing a virtual team, right? So when I wake up in the mornings, I start my discussions in Beijing, then I move to Bangkok, then I move to Nairobi, and I move to Brussels, Geneva, and I end up my days with Sao Paulo. So one of the first things that I really immediately understood to manage a virtual team, despite the COVID situation, because that was on day one, is attitude towards virtual interactions and your intentions. And you have to be very clear on those 2 points to build trust. And that's the link with the article, is the fact that, humankind has been wired in a way where, we build trust through interactions and human interactions and face-to-face situations. So how do you build that trust through basically, flat screens? And, it's super difficult if you apply the same paradigm, which is human interactions in face-to-face. So the first thing that, we had to adapt is it's not to have a virtual coffee break. It's not basically to have an escape game every month. Although we're doing that and it's fun, but this is not how you build trust. Building trust is, for me, it was very clear that it's not also about, you have to find your why, even though I love Simon Sinek, but it's also, I understood that you have to give and open the room for people to, just actually do what they have to do, give that kind of a space for failure, give that space actually so that they try out, leave them actually in action, and stay there with them to say, how can I help? How can I support? How do you need me on a daily basis to struggle with that problem? What tools do you need? What skills do you need? Are you looking for a training? What kind of project is actually in your passion pipeline to actually go in line with our strategy? And I think you have to manage people in a completely different way, because it doesn't work. The coffee machine chit chat is not there anymore to make it happen.
I was listening recently to some of the training that Linda Jonas and Jason Lawrenson produced for our platform on remote working. And they talk about the cultivation mindset, and they sum it up as saying, the job of the leader or the manager is to create the right environment, call it the fertile ground for growth, and to remove obstacles. And one of the things that we often do as managers or leaders is we try and point out mistakes, flaws, problems with their employees, as opposed to just staying focused on how do we make sure that they have a fertile ground to grow, and how do we make sure that we're removing obstacles and getting that out of their way. I wonder if you could take me back to our title for today, and perhaps in your own words, contrast the difference between what you see as traditional TA and progressive TA.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So maybe just to finish on the point that we were discussing about, maybe something that was interesting is that when I started working in my role, we always measure team satisfaction, which is, I think, a good way, or at least to have a benchmark. And at the early beginnings of starting this journey, we were around 59% of team satisfaction, which is rather low. So you have to start from there. Now, with this building on transparency, attitude, intention, and giving accountability in the floor and the opportunity to act, but also to fail, we have managed actually to get to a satisfaction rate which is oscillating between 82% and 89%, which is a good sign that we're going into the right direction. Mm-hmm. Now, I think if I answer to your question, in simple words, we were running an activity that was event based. We go to events, we meet up with candidates, and we try to convert that into applications and into hires. Obviously, when you have to recruit hundreds, if not thousands, of people this way, it's a little bit time consuming. The return on investment, it's not immediate, and it's super long term. You're building a relationship with candidates; they really enjoy that. But in the volatile world that we're living in, candidates will never ever wait for you again. And I think this is that was one of the key messages that I was saying, is that you can have a very strong brand, as we have, because we have a very noble cause, and people see it on day one and they experience that on day one. But they also have, a life to go through, and they have a career, and they want to build actually that, not wait 2 or 3 years to build and start building, because there's also, the competition that is moving very fast. So we were in a position where we needed to change, and we needed to change it fast, from an internal point of view, from an external point of view, bringing actually tools, new technologies, but also one of the most interesting but challenging part is obviously to bring people with you, which is for me the most complex part, because you can have the best strategy, but if people are not following you because they don't believe in your strategy, or because they don't actually see the meaning of doing that, it's not going to work. So we were actually in a multi-layer problem where it was super important for us also to finish one chapter, which was, that kind of event approach, and then move to today, which is going to a more proactive way of doing talent attraction and talent acquisition and employer branding. And this is where actually we start introducing, something that basically you, Johnny, extremely well, which is basic sourcing. Get into the, into the bloody, Boolean string world, which is the basics where to start. Then we start putting some kind of extra layers into this, which is, creating proactive pools of talent. Then we're now into market intelligence. So ideal situations where leaders in the organization, they are a little bit like asking for advice. They don't know where to recruit. They don't know where the talent is. So my team now is able to deliver insights, data, and advisory internally on where is the talent? Where can you recruit it? And actually, what's the best location to do that? So we moved from a very passive approach of doing things into a very strategic and proactive way of doing that. And basically, the next step is that we move from proactive to predictive. We want to actually get to the point where you don't even actually come to me saying, I need to recruit. I will call for a meeting for you, and I'll say, Johnny, you actually, your people could be leaving in less than 6 months or 1 year. Here's a shortlist. Here's a proposal for you to support your recruitment. What do you think? And this is a possible scenario that could happen. So this is where we want to go, and it takes some time, but I think in 2 to 3 years we will be there. And that's at the scale of the ICRC. It's super large, but it's super important. Voilà.
So let me once again connect those two pieces like you did as well. I imagine whilst we can take the process and talk about it's great sourcing processes, become better talent advisors, having better insights. If you have a team with an engagement score of 58, that's probably going to fail. So on the surface of it, you've mapped out exactly where any, I think, modern TA team should be going towards those areas. But tell us a little bit about the engagement piece. How did you fix that? Because I imagine all those plans would not have worked if you didn't have an engaged team. A team in their 80s means this is going to work, right? You've mentioned to me your attrition is down near zero. So what was it, do you think, that made that work?
I think it's a combination around. There are several things that could be included in that answer. The first thing is that sometimes when you start pivoting teams, some managers or some leaders believe that everyone needs to be somehow like convinced or on board, or you have to buy the buying of everyone. When you start having and introducing this kind of I would say 360 change, it has to be extremely transparent, and you have to accept that maybe 30% or maybe 40% of people are not going to follow you because they don't see it as a career progression. They don't actually see the meaning. You can bring the numbers, you can bring the data, you can bring the analysis, you can bring everything that actually is telling or supporting what you say. At some point there is it's like profit and loss. You know that you're going to lose something in the process, and sometimes it's not about losing people, but about giving that safe space of people saying, I don't agree with this approach and with this strategy. And that's perfectly fine. It's okay to disagree. Then it's finding an agreement, or, okay, where do you want to go in your career? And how can I help you as a manager in building your next step? And because, the organization, the institution, or any single company, you have your goals, you need to meet them, and you need to move forward. And at some point, that kind of a very transparent and two-ways collaboration with people to say, okay, maybe this time we're not walking together hand in hand, but let me help you. Let me find something else for you. So I think it's a little bit of a trade-off in not saying that this is where we go, you take it or you leave it. I think it's a very old school of doing things. So this way may take longer than expected, but at the end, you have two people being at least conscious and understanding the same topic at the same level. And that was something that was pretty much clear. And obviously, as you can imagine, I took people with me, and some people were like, you know what, this next chapter is not for me. I'm going to be just looking something else. And I said, brilliant. How can I help? Let me know, what can I do as a manager to to help you go into the next move. And I think that's basically, there's no magic sauce or magic recipe. This is how I did it, and it worked.
What does it take to be a recruiter for ICRC? Because I'm imagining, of course, there's lots of things that just are required to be a good recruiter anywhere, but it is different. You're not recruiting for software engineers to go build the next product. You're not recruiting for salespeople to sell more widgets. This is really affecting people's lives. I imagine you're talking to people through very, very personal things. You're dealing with a lot of stuff. Imagine it takes a very different type of character to do this well. Can you tell me a little bit about what you've learned about the character of individuals, the type of individuals who are successful in recruiting in this type of environment?
So we have different people involved in the process. So we have recruiters, we have talent attraction officers, but there's a common denominator within all these people. And I think there's something that it's really important, that as a recruiter or as a talent attraction officer at the ICRC, you need to understand extremely quickly that you're not giving the chance to someone to move from one job to the other. Actually, you have to be very clear with people that their life is going to change. That it's not just another job. It's a life choice, because you will find yourself in situations that you will reach your own limits as a human being. So it's not about how good you are, because we do recruit people with IT skills that go in the field, right? But it's not how good you are as a system administrator and changing servers. It's not how good you are into that coding thing, but it's about, how good you are not only with that, but coping with stressful situations, how good you are about not having a comfy life at all, and how good you are in adapting to very volatile situations, how resilient you are. And it's also about, how well do you know yourself and you know your own limits as a person, because we have 3 pillars at the ICRC, and this is basically our DNA, which means that we are impartial, independent, and neutral. And you have to deliver the same support and humanitarian action to all the parties involved in the conflict, which means that you're going to also be reaching your limits in terms of personal values, because you most probably will be helping something that you disagree from a human ethical point of view. So it's not about your project that has changed a product. It's really about how well do you know yourself, because this is going to change your life forever. It's not actually something that is going to be just a step in your career. So that's the kind of a difference and latitude that is completely different when you work at the ICRC as a recruiter. Nonetheless, we need to keep in mind that there is an external market of talent. So we cannot just actually, keep going with nice stories and telling you how good we are, because some people, they also see ourselves as a step in their career. We have people just coming in for, 2, 3, 4 years and they leave. So we have to also showcase the organization, and the recruiters and the talent attraction officers, they also need to showcase the organization as a step in your career. So we have so many different, what I call the spectrum of motivation at the ICRC, that they have to be able to see the difference between, the humanitarian person that will do that for life and the person that will do this for just 1 or 2 years and they go. So that's the kind of the spectrum that we have at the ICRC as a recruiter or as a talent attraction officer.
I absolutely love that phrase, spectrum of motivation. I haven't heard it before. I'm going to steal it off you.
Please.
you can guarantee that, because I think it's so true. There isn't just one reason. And this is where organizations will come up with an EVP, which is a list of things that they can say. These are the reasons why people will join us and how we can sell. But you have to really look at that spectrum of motivation. And although we talked about AI and you offered a different definition to the initialism, I think we also have to look at EI and the emotional intelligence of somebody to be able to understand, listen for that particular part of that spectrum of motivation, and then to sell back to that or tell a story that will motivate somebody. That's a unique skill. I find it, you talk about the development of a TA structure. My understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Michel, your team are still what we would call traditionally 360-degree recruiters. They're doing the finding and they're doing the selling and managing of the candidate flow. Do you ever think that could change in the environment you're in, considering how unique the roles are and the processes?
Mm-hmm. So if we look at a traditional week that my team is going through, so on Mondays they will do sourcing for Sinhala interpreters while they are doing HTML coding for our career website. On Tuesdays they start a job market analysis for engineering profiles in Africa, and then the afternoon they run an event, a virtual event in front of 700 people live. On Wednesdays, they work on a hyper-targeted recruitment campaign. On Thursdays, they will be most probably confronted to very complex recruitment needs to deploy people in the field. And on Friday, wrapping up all that and planning the next week in terms of strategic development of our team. So I think, what I have been trying to inject into our function is the fact that we have been doing three different things in one, which is multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary approach of talent attraction and talent acquisition, which means that we always go actually and look for the best things that, people do in marketing. We go and we see what's done best, in terms of storytelling. We go and we see what actually people do best in business analysis or data visualization, and we try to package all that together so that when you bring value to the client, it's like, my goodness, this is like incredibly high in terms of added value because I have the advisory, I have the deliverable, and I have actually vision for the future. So I think from my perspective, what I see is that our internal clients and customers are really buying 360 added value when you're not just delivering that job, you're delivering the data that goes with the job, you're delivering actually the context with that job, the market, actually actually how long that person is going to stay. Let me give you a concrete example. This morning we were having a discussion with Sao Paulo, and they were delivering a job market analysis internally, and they were telling to our people analytics team, your population stays less than 1 year in the job. So we need to adapt the job to make sure that we work on retention, right? So it's going way beyond your job and having a holistic approach of your role, which means that as a manager, you have to go super, super far, go and look for expertise in other disciplines, bring them back, and then integrate that into the job to create more diversified functions in terms of talent acquisition.
I think it turns on its head the traditional model that modernization of TA means segmenting the roles, breaking them into different chunks, having specialists, which, yes, on an enterprise scale, absolutely might be the right approach, but it isn't the only approach. And to show that, that deep specialism that comes from doing everything can be really beneficial, but also I imagine it's very motivating for the individuals. You get to touch every point of the hiring process. You go beyond the hiring process a lot. It probably attracts more senior people later in their recruiting career as well, who really want to develop, maybe aren't interested or not primarily focused on managerial opportunities, are focused on really doing difficult, interesting, and good work. I want to just kind of lastly ask you a couple of questions around the modernization piece. And you mentioned some tools earlier on, which is brilliant. If you had a open checkbook and you had all the project managers to implement your tools that you would want, are there any kind of core tools, technologies that you have particular interest in that you'd love to focus more on, invest more in, that you've plans for in the future, categories perhaps, or solutions that you're thinking about?
Yeah. So obviously we're using social talent, must have. apart from that, I think it depends. Again, I'm coming back to where do you want to add value. I'm going through the difficult choice of having a very, very 360 role. And the fact that you have a 360 role, you have to have extremely good sourcing tools. You have to have a ATS that is able, to do talent pipelining. When it comes to market intelligence, you have to decide if you're going to be doing reactive or proactive market intelligence, which means that you need to know and master the data of the different markets that you need to be as an advisor. In terms of employer branding, when you are dealing with a spectrum of motivation that is so complex, the EVP is not anymore actually a solution for you. It's way more complex. So there's no tool that is going to be offering you a diverse approach to tap that kind of a spectrum of motivation. And then when it comes to outreach, because we continue doing outreach, last event that we did, we were having 1,000 people connected just in 1 hour. So you don't manage an event the same way when you have 50 people than 1,000 people connected. So everything now is scaling up. So in terms of tools, for me, the first, takeaway advice, tip, or anything is that where do you want to add value and how scalable you want your function to become? And we have been actually quite ambitious because we don't have a lot of budgets, resources. And when I say it, I mean it, because, in the humanitarian sector, every single penny counts, right? I don't have the chance to build my entire reporting dashboard or cockpit into Tableau. We do have it, but it's too, actually, we are so small in the organization that there's no resources for us. So you need to be extremely creative to go from actually, traditional Excel reporting to something that actually has become a benchmark in the organization, in a sense that we wanted to make reporting great again. We did it with Excel and PowerPoint, but we created a very hyperlinked document that didn't cost anything. So I think sometimes we underestimate the investment that creativity can bring with simple tools such as Excel and PowerPoint. But then obviously, if you want to go that kind of an extra mile, you need to invest. We have already a suite of different tools that we use. We're trying to integrate a really strong and global data market analysis tool with one of a big firm, because this is a must-have. My dream is that every quarter, every leader receives a report that tells him or her, that's the status of the market. Here's your TA strategy for the next quarter. Boom, and that's it. So then we can start being proactive with people from that perspective. So that's a little bit like the takeaway. It really starts with where do you want to add value, and be creative enough to start with the tools that you have, and then go and buy the rest according to your own bucket of money.
I love that. Goes back to that entrepreneurial spirit and attitude you mentioned at the start of the show, which I think is so important. Michel, we're at time. I really thank you for joining us. Thank you for working through the internet connectivity problems we had at the start. It was great to have you rejoin and tell that story. It's an important story to tell, and some insight into your team. I'm going to ask you to close with perhaps one more tip for our shortlist. Every week we ask our guests to offer their tip for our short list of tips. And this can be something from your own career that you've learned yourself through your own mistakes or those around you, or it's something that perhaps has been imparted to you by somebody else. But perhaps if you wouldn't mind sharing that tip with our audience.
Yeah, absolutely, Johnny. And I think my takeaway from this situation and the current world that we're living in is that this is like a sort of a high-scale experiment that we're living. And as a manager, for the first time, I think the paradigm has completely changed. So it has become extremely difficult to be an efficient human and people-oriented manager today because the things have changed. And I think my takeaway has been to sometimes if you want to do more or exactly the same, stop talking about work. Take care of people. Really, I mean, in a very sincere and transparent way, and start asking to yourself, do I build trust on a daily basis? It's not about that chit chat thing about the performance discussion every 6 months or every quarter. Do you literally every single day build trust with your team, with your colleagues, with your peers? At the end of every single discussion, what's actually the piece of trust that you have built with them? And what did you pay attention to your intention and your attitude? Because things have changed a lot. So that will be my my little tip and takeaway, and it has worked extremely well for me.
I think it's great advice for anyone, regardless of their role. If you're leading teams, influencing teams, supervising teams, managing teams, building businesses, building on scale, to focus on that is absolutely the lesson we must learn from last year. Michel, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon or evening for you. Really appreciate your time. We'd love to have you on again on the show. It's terrible. Just before we went on live, I was telling our backstage production team how fantastic your technology is and the great microphones and cameras you have, and I think I cursed our broadcast with that, Michel. But thanks so much for sticking with us. Fantastic to have you on the show, and we'll have you on again soon.
Thank you so much, Johnny.
And for everyone listening, thank you so much for listening with us this week. I really hope you enjoyed the insight as to the International Committee of the Red Cross and what the ICRC's mission is, and really took from that insight as to how different recruiting can be. There are different models, and look at the complexity of teams like ICRC's recruiting teams, but how they've innovated, how that entrepreneurial spirit to build and develop and mature as a team, even without necessarily the budgets. Do come join us next week for show 52. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be broadcast live, as I said, on LinkedIn and YouTube at 4 p.m. UK time. That's 11 a.m. on the East Coast, 8 a.m. on the West Coast of the US, when Kingsley Aikens, the CEO of the Networking Institute, will be joining me to talk about no going back, the future of networking. I first heard Kingsley speak about 8-9 years ago at a talk in Dublin. He blew me away as to his amazing insight and knowledge around networking and the power of networking. And I've seen business leaders from some of the biggest companies in the world sit there with their jaws wide open listening to Kingsley's fantastic advice. Really look forward to having him on the show. If you are looking at how you build up your networking skills, which everyone should, join us next week for our live show, and we'll be able to ask Kingsley direct questions, or check out our podcast, which is going to be available on Wednesday evening on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find our podcasts. I hope you enjoyed the show. Hope you've learned a little bit about what humanitarian aid organizations like ICRC do and what the role of recruiter is there. I'm sure if you're interested in finding out about a career with the ICRC, Michel will be delighted to hear from you. And we'll hear from you next week. Thanks for listening.